Fantastic. So if there are any questions as I go along, would you mind, Soraya, telling me, just interrupting me and telling me? That would be amazing, because I generally don't look at the chat box when I'm talking. So
I'll let you know.
Please feel free to interrupt me at any time. More than happy to be interrupted. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a real, I've been following OPAC for years now and really admire the work that that you all do. So it really is a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about a few different things this evening. I have so much that I would love to talk to you about, and you know, I've only got 30 minutes, so I'm going to go over a few things kind of quickly, and I'll go into more detail on a few things as well. But I really, really want to invite you to ask me anything, and I really, really mean that. In my role as a childhood cancer survivor and a research scientist and an advocate for all sorts of things to make the lives of kids with cancer and their families better, I get a lot of questions, and I have never ever met one that has made me embarrassed or I don't want to answer. So you can ask me personal questions about science, my work, advocacy, anything you want. So please don't be afraid to ask. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of introduce the different things that I do, because I think it really helps people understand where I'm coming from in, you know, the stuff that I advocate for and you know, would love to see get better for kids with cancer in the future and their families too. So I'm a research scientist. I originally did a PhD in leukemia biology in the UK. As you can probably hear from my accent, I am not Canadian. I hope to be soon, but not quite yet. And so my PhD was on AML and a particular type of mutation called a fusion gene, which actually causes some types of both pediatric and adult AML. But I moved to Canada in 2017 and went to work in the lab of Dr. Uri Tabori, which some of you may know. He's a neuro-oncologist at SickKids. And he works on a rare genetic cancer predisposition disorder. And this means that the patients that we work on, very, very rare. They are genetically predisposed to develop lots of different types of cancers in childhood. It's called CMMRD. You may have heard of it, you may have not. It's pretty rare, but at SickKids we have this worldwide consortium which is designed to collect samples from these patients and their families, and more importantly, to help them manage their disease, to inform surveillance and scans for kids that are affected by this. And what we know is they develop leukemias, lymphomas, colon cancers, brain tumors, because essentially an important protein which repairs their DNA damage to their cells isn't working properly. So from the moment they're born, or maybe even before that, they accumulate DNA damage, which unfortunately can result in cancers. So that's the majority of my work at SickKids. And what I do is I'm one of your lab-based scientists. I have a white coat and I do all those kind of things with pipettes and syringes and that kind of thing. And what I do is I actually work on stem cells. And we get tiny little skin samples from kids and their families who are affected by this genetic disorder. And we make the skin cells into stem cells. So stem cells are the type of cells that can technically make any cell in the body. And then what I do is I make them into either tiny brains, they're about 2 millimeters in diameter, or tiny colons. And what I see is if these mini brains and these mini colons get tumors. And so this is from not a tumor sample from these kids, this is from a tiny sample of their skin. It's about 2 millimeters in diameter. It's normally taken under general anesthetic. It heals up within, you know, when they have some other procedure, it heals up within 3 days. Turn it into stem cells, and then we can turn it into brains, which always, you know, every time I talk about this, I think it's incredible that we can do this. So on the right here, I hope you can see my cursor. Please tell me if you can't. We have these little mini brains. They just look like little blobs. They're about 2-3 millimeters in diameter. They're white, as white gray as brains are, and they take about 6 to 7 weeks to grow from stem cells, and those are reasonably mature ones there. And then if you look at what's going on inside these tiny little mini brains, you can actually see structures which we would see in the actual brain if we looked at it on like a CT or an MRI scan. So there's gaps here, and these are in normal human brains, we would call these ventricles, which cerebrospinal fluid and various other things go through to provide nutrients to the brain. So we're looking at these mini brains in these kids predisposed for cancer to see whether they develop mini brain tumors, and if they can, we can try drugs on them and figure out how to treat them. And the use of mini brains and mini colons in cancer research is really kind of gearing up and picking up speed. There's a few other people at SickKids who also use mini brains to investigate different types of pediatric tumor. And the great thing about this is I have mini brains that I've made from kids which we know are predisposed to brain tumors, but they don't actually have a brain tumor yet. They might get one in the future, but before they do that, I can model what it would look like in the lab. So it's really, really cool work, and I'm mostly not going to focus on this in this talk, but if anyone has any questions at all about this work, I would love to talk to you about it. As you can tell, I'm really enthusiastic about it, so really ask me anything. I'm happy to explain more about this. As well as that, I'm a really passionate science communicator. When I was doing my PhD, I always used to get really frustrated about the fact that people used to give us money to do research, whether it be through a charity or through their taxes. It's much the same in the UK as it is in Canada. But we wouldn't really tell them what we were doing with their money, like anywhere near, with any specificity, or we might tell them 10 years after a project concluded if it had made a new drug or not. But we as scientists weren't communicating very well what we were doing in the lab at that time with people's, fundraising money. And I thought that was a bit weird. So I set up a Twitter account and I began taking pictures from the lab and like, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis? And what do I do with this DNA sample or these cells? Oh, sorry, was there a question?
No, Vicky, I think someone just came in, but they're muted now.
Oh, okay, no problem. So yeah, I got really frustrated. We weren't doing a better job of communicating to people, patients and cancer survivors and their families and friends what we were doing with the fundraising money. So I started tweeting about stuff we were doing from the lab. And weirdly enough, I was never much of a writer. I was never that good at English at school, but it kind of snowballed into me becoming a science writer as well. So I started doing like guest posts for the Guardian newspaper in the UK. I just after I moved to Canada in 2017, I started writing for Forbes. I did an internship at the Times in London shortly before that, and I just kind of built up doing some writing whilst I was being a scientist, because I was passionate about letting people know what we were doing, and kind of breaking down barriers between research science and patients and their families. Yeah, and I've won a couple of awards for that, and that's really nice. And in 2017, I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but I actually ended up doing a TED talk on cancer survivorship. And that was the first ever TED talk at the time, specifically on survivors of cancer rather than new cancer therapies and things. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Okay, so I guess the bit which kind of underpins why I do all of this stuff, I am myself a cancer survivor. There's an extremely fashionable me at sort of 7 or 8 years old. I was diagnosed with B-ALL, an intermediate prognosis B-ALL, when I was 7. I underwent 2.5 years of chemotherapy. I didn't have a bone marrow transplant or any radiation. If any of you are parents of kids with leukemia, you might be surprised to know that 25 years ago, we were only just switching between giving kids with leukemia radiation to remove the cells from the central nervous system. And we replaced that with a drug called methotrexate, which is now used almost all the time. And I was actually on the first clinical trial, which used methotrexate instead of cranial and spinal radiation. So some kids with leukemia do still get radiation, but it's much rarer now. Most kids with leukemia get methotrexate instead. So I was on one of the first clinical trials, which made that switch and basically said, you know what, methotrexate is a better alternative. So I'm now 26, 27 years, I can't remember, post therapy. I am pretty healthy. I'm very lucky to be pretty healthy. I've run half a dozen marathons and a marathon in 2015. My heart health must be pretty good. I came to Canada and I decided I wanted to ice skate from absolutely nothing. You have no idea how terrifying it is to put on skates for the first time when you're 31. Having never done so before, and it's taken me so long, but I can now skate fairly competently. So if any of you live in sort of the Little Italy, Palmerston area of Toronto, you may still see me at the local rinks. I wear my helmet and all the padding, because it's a long way to fall when you're in your 30s. But anyway, other than that, the only thing that I guess makes me a little different from somebody my own age, my age, who didn't have leukemia when I was younger. I have breast screening already, so I have yearly mammograms. And that's for two reasons. One, because I have a slightly worrying family history. 3 out of my 5 aunts have had breast cancer. It's not one of those, oh God, you're definitely going to get breast cancer, but it's just sort of maybe mildly worrying family history that I might be more risk. And we also unfortunately know now that high doses of anthracyclines to female childhood cancer patients can increase the risk of breast cancer. So those two things together, me and an oncologist at Princess Margaret, Women's College, basically decided it would just be a good idea if every year or so I have a mammogram, and that's it. Nothing's been found. I had my fertility checked a year ago. I'm 35 now, and I would, like to try and conceive perhaps in the next year or so. And so just because of my previous treatment, I had my fertility checked and all is good. So, okay. So I guess all of this kind of goes together with something else I'm really passionate about, and that's advocacy work. And I am very, very keen to always counter some, I guess, not myths, but sometimes misinformation about childhood cancer and treatment. So I think when I had cancer, it was about a 65 to 70% chance I would survive. So now somebody with an intermediate prognosis, BALL, like me, in countries like Canada or the UK or the United States, has more like a 90% chance of surviving their illness. So it's gone up quite dramatically in the last quarter century. God, that makes me feel old. But I think, and I've heard people say this at conferences, not recently and definitely not at SickKids, but people will sometimes say, well, you know what, childhood leukemia is cured now, right? Which is, as all of you know, patently wrong, because there are still kids who unfortunately don't make it. And also completely ignores the fact that to cure childhood leukemia, you have to be on 2.5 years of treatment at least. And unfortunately, there are often chronic side effects that survivors like me experience in the long term. And that's not even to mention different types of solid tumor in kids, brain tumors and things like that, where the survival is not as good. So sometimes I feel we've taken our eye off the ball a little bit with childhood cancer treatment. And one of the questions I got, actually, which I'll answer in the Q&A, which was, why don't we have more targeted therapies for childhood cancers? And I think that's really interesting, and I'll happily get into that afterwards. But a lot of my advocacy is for cancer survivors, particularly childhood cancer survivors, to advocate for a better kind of treatments. We shouldn't be having 2.5 years of therapy and then facing chronic long-term lifetime side effects. We should be working for, kind of therapies that don't come with those. And there is work ongoing. I'm not going to say there isn't, but that's just something I push a lot, because people look at me and they say, well, you've done marathons and you've got a PhD and you're totally fine. And I might be. I might not be in the future, and also I might just be one of the lucky ones. So I use a lot of my time to try and remind people of that, because I have a voice, to try and make sure that people know that it isn't always like that. So the thing on the right, I just want to say, sometimes I use the word like patient and cancer survivor, family member, caregiver, and things, and all these terms are kind of interchangeable, partly because I host talks to Canada, the UK, the United States as well, and the way that people talk about these things tends to vary kind of culturally, even between these 3 fairly similar countries. So I just want to say, like, just because I'm saying cancer survivor or patient or person with cancer or whatever, I just respect that people have their own terms and preferences. So just kind of wanted to say that up front. So I want to tell you a story a little bit about something that happened to me when I was on treatment, and what's happened about that since I was on treatment. So this is me in 1995 in another exceptionally fashionable get-up. That's my friend Leonie, who had AML. She is doing well nowadays. She actually breeds dogs for a living, and sometimes, and I think she breeds pugs, and she's a nursery nurse. So every time I look at her Instagram, I'm like, oh, you know what, maybe I should have done that, especially after a hard day in the lab. I'm just like, oh, that looks nice. But anyway, she's doing really well as her family, which is really nice. But while I was on treatment, as many of you will know, like, childhood cancer treatment is never straightforward. There's always complications. There's always things that go wrong. There's always like fevers is it an infection? Is it, what's going on? And when I'd had one of my intrathecal methotrexates, one night I'd returned home. My hospital was about 60 miles away from my house. So the hospital was St Bartholomew's in central London, and it was about an hour or so drive to where I grew up and where my parents' home was. And I had gone back there one evening, and I remember I was playing with my little sister, and my parents think we were playing a board game or something. And I was just being really obnoxious and mildly aggressive, I think, which for an 8-year-old girl, I mean, I wasn't very often. I was behaving really, really weirdly. And I think at the time, my parents had kind of put it down to steroids. If any of you have had children who've been on steroids, you'll know that mood swings and aggression and all sorts of things happen. My mum used to call me steroid head and said I was a complete nightmare. I don't remember much about it, of course, but I can believe it. So they just thought I was kind of playing up because I'd had the steroids. And I just remember I at one point I knocked a glass of milk over, I think for fun, I don't know. And then I got sent to bed because I was being an ass, basically. And I woke up the next morning, and I tried to get out of my bed, and I couldn't. I was paralyzed entirely down my left-hand side. And I screamed for my mum, and she came in and was like, what's wrong? And I was like, I can't move I can't move, kind of thing. And apparently she could see I was only like talking out of one side of my mouth, and it looked like I'd had a stroke. So I got rushed into the hospital very, very quickly. I remember they flew a load of doctors back from Paris because they were all at a conference, and so they arrived in hospital and they'd never seen this side effect or whatever the heck was going on with me before. It wasn't painful. I was just sitting there and I couldn't move the entire left-hand side of my body. And I remember my favorite doctor was kind of like, oh, the heck are you doing here? Pediatricians, they're always like, even if they're terrified, they're always really, really amazing. And I did all these tests and things, and then nobody could figure out what the heck was going on. But a few days later, I began to get the feeling back in my left side, and then I shuffled, and then it kind of came back very quickly. Like within a few days, I'd got full movement back in my left, and they had no idea what had happened to me. Like really, really no idea. They assumed it was because of the intrathecal methotrexate. And I actually want to just point out here that if any of you do have kids on treatment who are intrathecal methotrexate, this is very rare, so please don't panic. But so, as I said, that the methotrexate was successful. So I actually skipped my next dose of methotrexate because they were worried that this would happen again. And then they were like, you know what, you need the methotrexate because, it stops your leukemia cells coming back from your central nervous system. And this is the clinical trial I was a part of. It found methotrexate was a really, really good drug, and it meant that they could do away with cranial radiotherapy and spinal radiotherapy for most kids with intermediate or low risk ALL like me. But I was supposed to talk about that then. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. Well, there's my mom giving me some kind of injection, and me in a Bugs Bunny t-shirt, very exciting. But so this swap with methotrexate for radiation was a good one, because we know, unfortunately, that and many of you have experienced this, that cranial radiation can cause side effects, both acute and long term. So swapping out radiation for methotrexate in kids with leukemia who could have it worked out pretty well. But they did do a study to look at sort of how this might affect kids cognitively. We know, again, that cranial radiation can affect cognition in kids who have brain tumors. It turns out that using methotrexate as well, I think methotrexate can be used in kids with brain tumors, but it's mostly in kids with ALL and AML. But unfortunately, they found that also this methotrexate caused a slight problem with cognition as well. And I circle this lady because I actually grew up and published papers with her. So she was a young pediatrician at the time, and now we actually are on papers together, which is kind of nice. So, and she actually was on a paper which I'm just about to talk about with you, which looked at methotrexate side effects. So anyway, I had this rare side effect. I grew up, I did my PhD. This is Newcastle University in the UK. All British universities look like they're from Harry Potter. The one that is actually in Harry Potter is Durham University, which I went for my undergraduate degree, which is about 40 miles south of here. And they filmed all of the Quidditch scenes. And actually, when I was an undergraduate, they were recruiting my shorter classmates, because we're supposed to be like teenagers and younger kids, to be extras in Harry Potter. So I actually know several people who are extras in Harry Potter movies, but unfortunately I was way too tall to pass for a high school kid. So anyway, a bit of an aside there. So I grew up, I became a scientist. I did a PhD in leukemia biology, as I said. But throughout when I was doing my studies and things, my mum used to say, you remember that side effect, that damn side effect that you had while you're on treatment? That was terrifying. Did anyone ever figure out why that happened? Why did this happen? Like, you need to find out. And I used to say to her, I was like, Mom, I'm not a neuroscientist. Like, that's definitely a neuroscience problem. And she would just occasionally mention it to me, and I'd be like, I'm not a neuroscientist. You can't just jump from, leukemia biology to neuroscience. Although I ended up doing that quite a bit in the end. And then I met these two amazing people. This is John and his daughter Jenna. And Jenna had ALL much more recently. I think this picture is from 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. And they had actually, or John had come to a tour of our lab and a talk that I was doing about the work that we did, and to say thank you for people who donated and supported the work of Blood Cancer UK, which is the UK's main leukemia research charity. And I did a talk, and I shared the story that I've just shared with you all about my side effect that I had on methotrexate. And John, this guy, comes up to me afterwards and he's like, can I talk to you? Can I talk to you? And he's kind of like frantic. And I'm like, yeah, sure, of course. How can I help you? And he says to me, he's like, Jenna, my daughter, she had that 2 years ago, terrible, absolutely awful. What have they found out why yet? And I was like, wait, this stuff still happens? I assumed that because I was on the first ever clinical trial to swap in these medications, that something had happened since to mean that it no longer happened. Scientists, researchers, physicians, they'd figured it out and they'd found a way to stop it happening. And this guy's standing in front of me saying it happened to my daughter 2 years ago. And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. I really don't know. So shortly after this, I had, I don't know, a spare afternoon in the lab while some experiments were running, and I did a literature search on it. So I typed into PubMed, it has all the medical research in all the world on it, and I typed it in. I was looking at methotrexate, and stroke-like syndrome is the thing that I had. They ultimately called it something, and I found lots of descriptions of it happening, rarely, very rarely. Way less than 1 in 100 kids who have leukemia treatment have this, and some, pleasingly, some documentations on these case reports saying, this happened, but kids recovered fully. They recovered fully. Okay, fine. But nobody had ever figured out why this happened. And I was like, oh my word, why? Why? This is something that happens to enough kids. Why has nobody ever figured out why this happened? So I was getting to the end of my contract doing leukemia research there. And at that time, I wanted to stay in the UK for various reasons. And so I just decided to dig into it a little bit. I contacted some neuroscientists I knew, and I was like, why is this happening? I talked to some pediatric oncologists, including Chris Housley, who I circled on the previous paper I showed you, and kind of came up with a plan and ended up writing a 1-year pilot project grant to try and figure out, why does methotrexate cause this very rare side effect in some kids, but mostly not. Only very rarely does it cause this side effect. And is this anything to do with the fact that in some survivors of childhood ALL, it can cause cognition problems? Why hasn't anyone looked at this yet? So I decided to look at it myself. And during researching this project and trying to figure out what my hypothesis was and things, I spoke to this lady, and this lady is Dr. Judith Kingston. She was a very senior pediatric oncologist in the UK, and she was my doctor. She was the first person I saw on the ward when I was admitted to the hospital, and she managed my treatment throughout the entire time that I was on treatment. And at this point, I hadn't seen her for, it was about 6 or 7 years ago now. I hadn't seen her for probably 10, 12 years at that time, because I'd moved for my follow-up clinics. I'd gone to college and, moved away 300 miles or something in the UK. And I emailed her and I was just like, hi, remember me? And then I basically went straight to I was like, how are you? Hope you're good, kind of thing. I went straight to the point. I was like, I have this idea and I need to figure out why this happened to me and why it happens to other kids. And I was like, could you please get me this relevant section of my own medical notes so I can like basically have a look and see whether my hypothesis fits with me. And a few, maybe a month or so later, I remember it was Christmas Eve, she stumbled into this cafe in central London holding these yellowed pile of like notes where she'd put post-its and things over them, and we sat, we had coffee, we talked about all sorts of things, life, and then we talked as scientists, which was really bizarre because I was, you know, in my mid to late 20s at that point, and you know, this is my doctor, the first person I saw when I was 8 years old on the ward, and here she is talking about science with me, and you know, it was incredible. And so I'm aware of the time, by the way. I'm not going to go on for too much longer, but I'll just finish this story. And yeah, we basically came up with some really interesting clues as to why this might have happened to me. So other drugs that I'd had at the time, things to manage pain, and anesthetic that might have contributed to how this drug interacted with those other drugs and may have caused this stroke-like syndrome in me. So please largely ignore this diagram. I could happily send it to anyone if you're super interested in it, but basically what we wanted to look at, so some of you will be aware of a disease called multiple sclerosis. And what happens in multiple sclerosis is the immune system attacks the insulation on nerves and stops electrical signals going through them as well as it would. And people with multiple sclerosis can have sort of on-off symptoms. Sometimes they're really bad, sometimes they recover, sometimes it gets better. It's very, very unpredictable. So what we thought was, this isn't multiple sclerosis, but what if it's something that's kind of similar? What if the drug, in interacting with some other drugs, actually causes the insulation lining of the nerves to become a little weaker at some point? Because what happened to me in the half-sided stroke, it basically was my nerves weren't working properly, and then it got better, and then it came back. So we hypothesized that the methotrexate, in combination with other drugs and other levels of all sorts of things you see down here, which is kind of complex, maybe caused what we call a temporary demyelination in me. Okay. So we actually ended up publishing a few scientific papers on this, and worked with Chris, again, who ran that study I was a participant in, looking at cognitive and IQ issues. And what we basically said was like, hey, you shouldn't be using, there's a particular type of anesthetic called nitrous oxide, which is known as laughing gas, actually. You might get it when you go to the dentist or something like that, but it's in some places it's used as an anesthetic, analgesic, or one of several drugs that they use as anesthesia. And we looked into it, and there's loads of things already written, you know, pharmacological textbooks and things going, whoa, you shouldn't be using nitrous oxide at the same time as you're using methotrexate, because they work on the same pathways, right? So if you give one of them at a time, it's fine. But if you give both of them together, boom, can cause problems. And so we basically did, you know, wrote these papers going, whoa, guys, we know you're still doing this, because we like surveyed a load of hospitals in the UK. About half of them are still doing it. Like, stop, please stop now. It's, you know, we have other anesthetics, other analgesics, they're just as good. It's not like you need to use this one. Please stop. And just as an aside, you'll be glad to know we also asked SickKids, and they don't use it. And I don't think it's widely used in Canada either. So that's really, really good. But what we're saying is not that this one thing definitely causes it, but it could be a risk factor to cause this. And I had a whacking dose of nitrous oxide the day before I had methotrexate. So it's one of those things where I don't have any samples from myself, or any kids where this really happens, it happens to, although we collected them afterwards, and we did another research project about that. But we just wanted to remove the extra risk, and so we published these papers just saying this isn't a good idea. And I guess I'll pretty much end on this one. So this isn't my work. This is the work of an incredible woman who works at Stanford. She's a neuro-oncologist called Michelle Monge. And I know Michelle pretty well, and she is probably one of the world's best scientists. I truly think the world of her. And if you, she recently did a trial of CAR T cells in DIPG, one of the first people in the world to do that. She does all sorts of wonderful stuff. I can't speak highly enough about her. But anyway, she and incredible team of neuroscientists a few years ago put out this piece of research, and it actually was spurred on by talking to breast cancer survivors. So methotrexate is also used in people with breast cancer, not all the time, but sometimes. And often breast cancer survivors will not complain, that's the wrong word, will report that they're experiencing this thing that they kind of term chemo brain. And it's really difficult to kind of put what are these symptoms on it. They report fatigue, general cognition problems like memory issues. They just don't feel right, like their brain is not working properly. And for literally decades, cancer survivors, including people with spike breast cancer, have said, this is really affecting my quality of life. This is bad. Will somebody please look at it? And because everybody is so focused on cure and not so much on what happens to people afterwards, for years and years and years, nobody did anything about it until Michelle Monge and her team was like, hey, we can try and figure this out. So what they essentially found is you saw that little diagram that I made. They did it in sort of 100 times better, more detailed way. And they went in and they found exactly what methotrexate does to different types of brain cell. And it causes them to kind of basically go after each other and get really upset, and the whole balance is messed up. And then this causes cognitive issues. And it probably also is the same thing that caused the stroke-like syndrome that I had. So this paper was incredible because it was the first time that research into a treatment-related side effect attracted the superstar team of neuroscientists to look at, and Cell, this journal that is published in, is the best journal in the world. Like, it's the highest impact journal in the world, pretty much. And so the good news is they're now actually testing therapies to try and reverse this chemo brain thing. I'm sure at some point childhood cancer survivors who may be experiencing cognitive symptoms as well will be included. And a very interesting tangential aside, a lot of people have been reporting cognitive issues with long COVID. A recent paper by this group found out it's the same kind of thing happening. So chemotherapy, long COVID, seems to be the same cells getting all weird and banging up against each other and not working as they should. So interestingly, because there are therapies already under investigation to treat this chemo brain, the same therapies are probably going to be useful for people with cognitive long COVID, which is amazing, really. Okay, so I'm not going to take too much longer. I'm good. Okay. So as I said, chemo brain is a topic pushed into focus because patients have talked about it. So one thing that I'm really passionate about is getting patients and families and survivors talking to researchers and being an integral part of research topics and groups, not just being like, hey, we need somebody to put on here to tick box for our grant or something like that. No, I want people involved actually saying what we should research. And my TED talk is on YouTube. It's like 4.5 minutes long if anyone wants to watch it. I basically talk about the importance of asking people with cancer and survivors, what do you want us to research? What's important to you? And also, how do you want to get involved? Like, do you want to be on the research team? Do you want to help us analyze the results? That's the kind of thing we should be doing to get the most impactful, innovative research.
Vicky, I have a question here on the chat. I don't know if you want to address
it. Yeah,
now.
Go for it.
Fatima is asking, to your knowledge, are there any chemotherapy drugs that are flagged for causing or contributing to cognition issues such as short-term memory issues or short attention span used with children?
Yeah, methotrexate. I mean, other than that, I'm not sure. But the methotrexate is the one that we really know can cause cognitive side effects. Things like steroids, dexamethasone and things like that cause all sorts of behavioral changes, and we know that, but I'm not aware of any research that says they cause long-term cognitive issues. Methotrexate is definitely the one out of the cocktail of things that we give our kids. Methotrexate is the chemotherapy agent, at least, which they think can cause cognitive issues in some long-term survivors, not everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to talk about this because I'm running out of time. Okay, yeah, all right, I'm just about done. So anyway, what I'm really passionate about now and what I hope to do for the rest of my life is to bridge these gaps, to get more people like parents, patients, survivors into research, because sometimes there's too much of a disconnect between researchers and what they want to research and patients and what they prioritize. So we really need to be doing better to kind of, get everybody together working on this. And I think a key part of doing this is communication, right? Because scientists, sometimes we talk in ridiculous jargon and, we pretend that nobody could ever possibly understand this, and it's complete rubbish, because I can talk about my research to anyone, a 5-year-old, an older person with limited English. Like I literally, it just requires effort and skills, and I think sometimes we do not prioritize how important communication is, especially from a scientist or a researcher's side. I see a lot of patients, a lot of survivors, a lot of family members doing incredible amounts of advocacy and work for free, and what I see on the research side is not always them being receptive to involving patients and survivors and family members. So just wanted to end by talking about Dr. Kingston. So Dr. Kingston actually passed away just a few years ago, and she just about saw the first piece of our work published. But I just think it's a wonderful example of the connection sometimes between, incredible pediatric oncologists. I genuinely think pediatric oncologists are some of the best people in the world, and what they do for their patients, and not just oncologists, but nurses and occupational therapists and psychologists and people as well, that she, was so happy to meet me and talk about things of science and just help me out, really kind of, underlay her a lifelong commitment to helping people. And it was very sad to see her pass a few years ago, but I'm sure you all know a pediatric oncologist like Dr. Kingston, and yeah, we're really lucky to know them. So I'm going to stop there. I really would love you to ask me anything. Again, I'll reiterate, please don't think any topic is is not okay. Like, nothing's too personal. Please ask away. I'm happy to talk about my own experience or elaborate on some of the science. I know some of that was a bit quick, so if there's any more questions you have, please let me know. I would love to talk to you.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you so much. And I do have a question here on the chat from Rebecca. And she says, my son was on very high doses of methotrexate for osteosarcoma, and his oncologist thinks that his difficulty with math afterwards is because of it. Have there been studies about that? Previously, he was getting A's in math, and after treatment struggled to get his credits.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a physician, but as I said, we know that methotrexate does cause cognitive problems, and cognitive is a weird term, right? It's fairly broad because it can mean all sorts of things with regard to memory, to processing speed, etc., etc. Weirdly enough, I was also a math, superstar, and I did okay afterwards, but math quickly became not my best thing. And I don't know whether that's correlated or just a general lack of interest that kids sometimes go through. I mean, obviously I do enough of it being a scientist, but I kind of went off math. I was, when I was 4, I was doing math for 12-year-olds. So, I really, really liked math, and then didn't so much afterwards. But yeah, I can't say. And the problem with these kind of things is because the kid, I got the same treatment I got 25 years ago is the same treatment mostly that kids on treatment now will get. So picking out exactly what causes what can sometimes be quite difficult. But I do know that methotrexate is associated in some kids, not all, with cognitive issues, and math could definitely be one of the way in which that presented. And if your child's oncologist says that, then I would think they're very up to date on the current research and things. And yeah, it could be a factor for sure.
And we had also received this question in advance. Why have there not been any new, less invasive treatments for childhood cancer?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something I think I alluded to earlier in the talk, kind of, saying that, there's been a lot of focus on cure, and we must focus on curing the kids that still don't make it. But in some way, there is still an opinion like, okay, you've got your 12 chemotherapy drugs that give you a 95% cure rate for BLL, so that's it, we're done. And I hate that, and I have been known to go to people at conferences and just like argue with them respectfully over that, because I just think it's ridiculous. So truth is, putting my science hat on, there are a few new targeted treatments. There are, for a certain type of leukemia, there is a drug called imatinib, which specifically goes for the genetic problem that causes the leukemia. We now have CAR T cells for some children with relapsed leukemia, which are, they really are helping people. But I think the hope was, and I'll speak to CAR T cells as an example, the hope was that maybe we could replace conventional chemotherapy with CAR T cells for kids with leukemia and get rid of all these like toxic chemotherapy treatments with the long-term side effects. But the truth is CAR T cells also come with problems, which you kind of have to iron out before you start giving them to everybody. And neurological and cognitive issues is one of the things that can happen with CAR T cells too. So in order to replace something that's quite successful, and I'll talk to brain tumors and solid tumors in a minute because I don't want to exclude them, but in order to replace something that's quite successful objectively, like chemotherapy for childhood leukemias, with something that's new and experimental, you really have to prove that it's better. It's a leap of faith. At some point in the next 10, 20 years, I do hope we will do that. Like we'll either CAR T cells or something else. There's a load of research into things called cancer vaccines at the moment, which are really exciting, where basically, actually mRNA vaccines were always supposed to be used for cancer, would you believe, before COVID. And so the idea is you could actually create an mRNA vaccine to go specifically after your cancer, on the specific genetics of it, and then your immune system will go after it. So that might be something that happens more, but for leukemia it's difficult because you've got to be convinced that nothing will happen to that 90-95% success rate you have if you swap out everything that works for something which is not. But with regards to things like brain tumors and solid tumors, I must admit I had hoped for more targeted treatments by now, because obviously there's some types of brain tumors that are exceptionally difficult to treat and still have a very low survival rate. Michelle Monge, for example, is trialing targeted treatments for DIPG, but we've been trialing targeted treatments for DIPG for some time now, and we've not found anything that really works. Brain tumors are especially difficult because everything we give has to go past the blood-brain barrier. So if you inject a drug into a person with a brain tumor, it doesn't always go through, and that's something we have to be aware of. With brain tumors as well, toxicity is a huge thing. So if you cause too much cell death in the brain, whether to tumor tissue or healthy tissue, you can unfortunately kill the patient. So the answer is I don't exactly know. It is exceptionally difficult, and there's also a leap of faith sometimes that needs to be done to like switch out something that we know works in most cases for a new experimental treatment. But I do think mRNA vaccines are going to be very interesting, and I know that sounds like, because we're so used to hearing them being used for COVID-19 nowadays, but actually they were always supposed to kind of be for cancer. With the idea that you sequence a patient's tumor and then you create a bespoke mRNA vaccine against them, you put it in, and then the immune system goes boom. And I think they're already in trials for various different types of cancer, adult tumors, probably things like lung cancer. So I think that's going to be something to watch over the next decade or so, because they were always supposed to be used for cancer, really. It just so happened we got hit with a pandemic and they got to coronaviruses, but they're pretty cool.
Very cool. Fatima is asking, what are your thoughts on proton therapy versus radiation for children with Hodgkin's lymphoma, or just in general, your thoughts on proton therapy?
Yeah, so I'm going to be quite honest and say that's not something I have a lot of expertise on. I'm always careful not to kind of overstep my mark. I have less knowledge about it than you guys do, because all I know is that in some situations, proton's definitely better. And in some, it's not thought to have any advantage over standard radiation. So that's really the extent of my knowledge about that kind of radiotherapy. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. And there was another question submitted in advance. Did you experience PTSD from your experience as a cancer survivor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for asking that, because a lot of people maybe wouldn't. And I think it's a really important one to ask. So if you'd asked me this 6 months ago, I would have said no. And actually, I'm going to say yes in some respects now, and I'll explain why. So I got to be honest, I'm one of those people, I feel like sometimes people go one way or the other. They, when they grow up, they don't want to know anything about cancer. They just want to have their lives, not do anything to do with it. And then there's a small, not so small segment of us that go on to become doctors and nurses and scientists and kind of immerse ourselves in doing this kind of work and the meaning behind it. So it's an interesting kind of stretch between the two. But I've never had any problem with like having a blood draw or talking about my experience or anything like that. But one thing that I did have a problem with, which makes me think it is some kind of PTSD for sure. So in August 2020, I slipped a disc in my back. Was doing nothing in particular, got a bulging disc in my back. May or may not be related. I kind of have some suspicions that it might be related to the methotrexate injections I had 25 years ago, but this is something I'm trying to get some research going on about. I have no evidence to that. It's just a theory currently, so we'll skip over that. But anyway, I slipped a disc in my back. I had physio for months. It took me out of work for a long time. I couldn't sit. Me sitting is like a this year thing, so it's kind of nice to be able to do that. I could walk and I could stand and I could ice skate, but I just couldn't sit down for any length of time. So the doctor eventually, end of last year, I think September, October time, said, okay, we're going to try a steroid injection in your back because you've kind of improved, but not to a point where we're happy with, not to a point where you can sit down for any more than 15 minutes at a time. So I, a couple of days before the injection was scheduled, which I knew was going to go into my spine, I just began being very unhappy, like moody, very upset, like just irritable. My partner would, ask me something like, what's going on, kind of thing. What the heck is that thing? So I get to this clinic in North York or whatever, and I'm scared. I am terrified, absolutely terrified. And I'm thinking about it. I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you? You've never been worried about. But the thought of somebody putting a needle in my lower back like they did when I was 8 years old, I freaked out. I utterly freaked out. And I got there and, it's COVID, so my partner couldn't come with me and stuff. So I got to the clinic and I managed to get in the room and I start crying. Right. And then it's like I'm surrounded by like old people who have knee injections and stuff. And it's just me, youngish, having, needing this thing in my back. And doctor's like, what the hell's going on? And I'm trying to just tell him I've had this previous experience and that kind of thing. And basically I managed to lie down and have the injection. And it was so painful and so horrible. And I don't remember anything for the 2 hours after that. I vaguely remember walking to the pharmacy. I had to pay some of the injection cost. Insurance covered some of it. I had to go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist just said to me at one point, she's like, hey, just there's a seat over there, just go sit down, I'll be with you in a minute. I had no idea what was going on. I was just standing in line for the pharmacy, and this amazing pharmacist, who I probably should send a message to or whatever, had obviously seen that I was in shock, and she bought me a bottle of water and made me sit down and take my mask off and stuff. And she made sure I knew how to get home and that kind of thing. But I didn't say a word. I must have just looked like I wasn't functioning. And then I somehow took the bus and the subway home, and I got to my house, and then I didn't speak for 3 or 4 hours. I just couldn't. And it's interesting, if I look back at it, I'm just like, whoa. So I've done a TED talk. I stood on the stage in front of 3,000 people and did a TED talk, like no bother kind of thing. And I do all these things, and I moved to Canada in 2017 just with 2 suitcases and nothing else, and just moved my life over here as a leap of faith. And I went into shock over an injection in my back. So again, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd have said, nope, I'm good, kind of thing. But obviously with that very specific thing, then yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no other reason why I would have reacted like that. And I spoke to my doctor about it afterwards, and he's like, yeah, that makes sense. And had some therapy about it as well, just to try and make sense of it and package it away neatly and that kind of thing. So yes, but I would say very specifically, if that makes any sense. So
thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Any questions, any other questions for Vicki about her work or about survivorship? And now's your chance to ask. You can just turn on your mic or type it in the chat before we go. Okay. I don't think there are any more questions, Vicki. I'm just giving a little time, but I just want to thank you for sharing this fascinating work that you're doing thank you for all the important research that you're doing as well for our kids, for other survivors, and for sharing your story so openly and honestly. Thank you so much.
Of course,
And
no,
everybody's just saying thank you, thank you, thank you for your wonderful talk. Very wonderful. So
no, it was a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone wants to ask anything afterwards. I'm more than happy to field any questions or talk to folks or whatever. Like, it's a real pleasure. I was thinking when I was preparing for this talk, just like, I wish that my mom had a group like this when I was on treatment. I really do. So I really am appreciative of everything that you do for the community and stuff. So it was great to talk to you. And please do get in touch with any questions. More than happy to answer them.
I just wanted to remind our parents who are on here that we do provide a peer-to-peer free virtual right now service from our parent liaisons who do virtual chats like this on Zoom every Tuesday night at 7:30. And we have speakers like Vicki monthly, the last Wednesday of every month, speaking on topics of interest to child cancer families. And there's more information about OPAC at opacc.org on our website. So thank you again, Vicki, for this wonderful talk, for sharing your story. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. Have a good night. Bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.